People are left with no option, either to die by bullet and shelling or die by starvation.
Terror has become a common currency.
People are literally under siege.
This is an entirely man-made crisis and a shameful stain on our collective conscience.
Is it about people or is it about power and wealth?
Darfur, a region of Sudan, part of a brutal war destroying the country. The international community is especially worried about Darfur and describes the situation here as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with the risk of widespread famine and genocide for the second time in 2 decades.
The current humanitarian catastrophe is unprecedented. I don't think in our lifetime anything like this will happen.
But who is fighting? How did it get here? And why is this happening again? Sudan's history is entrenched in war. For a short moment, it seemed to be on a path of civilian rule. But a military coup in October 2021 upended all hope. And on 15th April 2023, an all-out war broke out again. Sudan's capital, Khartoum, was turned into a battlefield. At the heart of it, these two generals, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the leader of the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, and his military rival, Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemedti, who is heading the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. The two men go way back. They first crossed paths in Darfur in the early 2000s, where they were allies for a while. Both were military leaders in the region during the first genocide. But they eventually fell out, and their war is now being waged throughout the country. And Darfur is at the center of it.
The level of violence that we see in other parts of the country, which is, very, very, very high, is particularly concentrated and acute in parts of Darfur.
But why? And what hope is there for peace for the people living here? The region has historically been the RSF's stronghold, and that's where their militia was born. They currently control the 4 southern states, but the RSF and SAF are now fighting over the northern part of Darfur and its capital city of El Fasher. Around the size of Spain, Darfur has always been a coveted land. It is rich in resources, but that wealth has fueled many conflicts. People's livelihoods here depend on both farming and herding, and its location is key for trade.
Darfur is really, first and foremost, an exporter of livestock. One of the largest exports of livestock in the entire African continent, where it's traded not only to other parts of Africa, but mostly to the very oil-rich countries of the Gulf, through central Sudan and all the way up to the Gulf countries and the Horn of Africa, and including Egypt. The livestock has been the mainstay of the fortunes of Darfur and the politics of Darfur.
Desertification caused by climate change across the Sahel belt has been a driver of conflicts throughout the region. In Darfur, this has forced the most northern herding tribes to move south to seek grazing land and water for their livestock. But the struggle for power in Darfur isn't limited to land. Control over the region's abundant resources have been fiercely contested by various groups, from local warlords to global corporations.
This country is very vast, and the potential for mining in Darfur is huge. There is oil, uranium, underground water, but the real driver for this conflict is gold.
According to the UN, gold smuggling networks are rife in Darfur and Sudan in general, and they are believed to be funding the conflict. The smuggled gold finds its way to neighboring countries like Chad, Egypt, and Libya, all the way to the Gulf states, especially the UAE, where it is refined and sold on the global market. Another player is Russia. Several reports have indicated that the mercenary group formerly known as Wagner, has been heavily invested in Sudan's gold industry, mainly thanks to contracts negotiated by former head of state Omar al-Bashir. More recently, on the eve of the Ukraine war, Hemeti visited Russia and developed ties of his own. Russia-affiliated groups are now known to be providing security and technology to mine the very important metal in exchange for preferable rates, further entangling external powers in today's conflict.
The war in Sudan is no longer just a local affair. It is spilling over across 7 boundaries. And so the international community has realized very firmly, there's no question, that the war in Sudan is affecting everyone's interest and may actually lead to an expansion of the conflict in the Sahel and in the Red Sea region.
A UN report dated January 2024 said it had credible evidence that the UAE had been involved in more than gold trading, supplying weapons and ammunition shipments to the RSF several times per week. And in the early 2000s, it was China, a long-standing partner of Sudan, heavily involved in its oil trade, that was accused of supplying weapons and military equipment to the Sudanese armed forces.
Many countries in Africa are attracting international interest, and Sudan and Darfur are no exception. The UAE, Russia, China, Turkey, and Iran all have interest in what's happening in Sudan.
The alleged involvement of powerful external actors supplying weapons and money is reinforcing the local conflicts between the different armed groups seeking control of the valuable commodities.
In the case of the Darfuri rebel groups, most of them are aligned with ethnic communities that control access to land and to resources. So when these groups seize control of a new area or a new territory, it's almost always going to be violent, it's going to trigger displacement, and it could be very bloody.
So this fight over gold, oil, or even fertile land is in fact a matter of survival and dominance.
The war in Darfur is the result of many conflicts, and none of those conflicts have ever been sufficiently resolved, which is why we have this resurgence in violence there, and the war really taking root in Darfur in today's war in Sudan.
To understand this, we need to rewind even further back. Ethnic clashes are neither new nor uncommon among Darfur's diverse population. Rooted in divisions left by colonial rule, they trace back to the 1960s. What began as occasional disputes over fertile land gradually intensified, turning into ongoing armed conflicts between the region's different communities.
20-something years ago, we saw, as a result of global warming and climate change, the desertification in Darfur really increased. And this put the pastoralist groups who identify as Arab and the farmer agricultural groups who identify as African really in conflict with each other.
In 2003, a rebellion started there. It was led by the Sudan Liberation Army, a coalition of Fur and Zaghawa African communities who felt that the Khartoum government, led by Omar al-Bashir and mainly made up of Arabs, was marginalizing them. Their access to economic resources and social services were limited, and they were less represented within Khartoum's successive governments. Wanting to crush the rebellion, the then ruler Omar al-Bashir outsourced the fight to local Arab militia that were already involved in the ethnic clashes. They were called the Janjaweed.
The outcome is a horrific kind of ethnic-based violence against the Masalid, Zaghawa, and the Fur, but the central cause, the root cause, is political.
Historically, the conflict in Sudan has been looked at through the ethnic prism, but at its heart, it's a political problem. It's a problem of political representation and social justice.
Hundreds of thousands of people were killed and more fled to neighboring Chad in the following years.
Humanitarian aid is still desperately needed. More than 1 million people have left their homes and they are still too frightened to go back because of the gunmen.
The Janjaweed were later accused of carrying out systematic killings of non-Arab villagers in Darfur, committing war crimes and crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court. And in 2010, Omar al-Bashir became the first president in office to be charged with several counts of genocide.
I concluded that genocide has been committed in Darfur and that the government of Sudan and the Janjaweed bear responsibility and that genocide may still be occurring.
Peacekeeping missions were sent one after another. But in the background, something was brewing. The Janjaweed grew stronger during the insurgency, forcing al-Bashir to make them a legitimate arm of the military. And that's how the Janjaweed became the RSF, with Hemeti at its head.
It was during that time that South Sudan gained its independence and Sudan lost most of its oil revenues. That put a lot of economic pressures on the government of the then dictator Omar al-Bashir.
After months of civilian protests in Khartoum, the two infamous generals, Hemeti and al-Burhan, forged an alliance to overthrow Omar al-Bashir as head of state. And after 30 years of brutal reign, the ruler was ousted in a coup.
The time of the revolution was a time of excitement. I remember being there, reporting on the revolution and feeling the palpable hope that was in the streets, that people were looking forward to a better future. But in 2021, there was the military coup, and in 2023, that led to a war between the army and the RSF.
Now spanning over 2 decades, this relentless war has plunged Darfur and Sudan into the worst humanitarian crisis in recent history.
Conditions throughout Sudan are indeed appalling and getting worse by the day.
What is happening in Sudan right now is one of the most dire humanitarian situations in the world.
حياتنا صعيدة والله ما شاء الله بنظروا في زراعنا وما نشتروا ايش من السوق ولا ويك من السوق الا كان نشتروا الملابس واللحوم ذات عندنا البهايم الصغيرة في نربون في البيوت والبهايم ده كله هسه ياهو خرطوا شالوا لين.
This region that used to grow cereals and export livestock abroad is now on the brink of collapse, with high levels of malnutrition and the risk of widespread famine.
Both protagonists really are extremely worried and wary of food being delivered to their enemies, so to speak. So they prefer, I hate to put it this way, to starve their enemies rather than to allow food delivery to go through.
The UN says that both SAF and RSF are using food as a weapon of war and knowingly starving civilians. They're accusing the two warring parties of blocking, looting and exploiting humanitarian assistance. Fires and scorched earth techniques have caused displacement on a mass scale.
Both sides are endangering people's lives. Sudan armed forces are using airstrike, indiscriminately bombing civilians' homes, bombing schools, hospitals, bridges, water sources. The nature of the systematic attack by the rapid support forces is very clear because when they come into the city, they first make sure that they eliminate all survival means by looting the food storages, looting the market, and burn the remaining amount.
The battle over the city of El Fasher has pushed millions of civilians to flee into camps that were created 20 years ago during the previous war and already home to several generations of internally displaced Sudanese.
Some people had been in those camps for decades due to the first wave of displacement in the early 2000s. And effectively, they've now been joined by many, many more.
We have an entire generation that is simply not going to school, millions and millions upon millions. And of course, you have a spate of horrific sexual assault and rape and violence used as an instrument of war against not only the women in Darfur, but women throughout the country.
Credible reports of rapes, crimes against and affecting children, persecution on a mass scale inflicted against the most vulnerable civilians in Sudan and certainly the most vulnerable people in Darfur.
The already dire situation in Darfur is rapidly deteriorating. With supplies running out and medical facilities in ruins, the struggle for survival is becoming more desperate by the day.
As of now, we are calling for an urgent civilian protection forces and immediate delivery of humanitarian aid.
This war is going to have lasting impacts for generations to come. It has really torn the fabric of this country apart. And it's going to be very hard to recover from.
Humanitarian aid should not be negotiated.